All right, listeners, ready for another deep dive. You guys sent in a ton of stuff about Bitcoin in El Salvador, and we're going to try to break it all down.
Yeah, definitely a lot of interesting stuff here.
Yeah, so El Salvador, the first country to adopt Bitcoin as legal tender. What a story.
Really is.
Huge implications, potentially.
Yeah, big experiment.
Yeah, so we got a lot of excerpts from Wikipedia. It's like that's what most people sent in. So yeah, let's dive in and figure out what's been going on down there.
It's been fascinating to watch unfold, for sure.
Absolutely. So, uh, to really understand this whole thing, I think we got to rewind a bit.
Right.
Before Bitcoin was even on the radar, El Salvador was already using the U.S. dollar as their official currency.
Yeah, that's right. They dollarized their economy way back in 2001, got rid of their own currency, the colon. It was, a way to stabilize their financial system, they hoped, attract foreign investment and simplify things when it came to trade. Basically, using the U.S. dollar, they were aiming for a more predictable and globally integrated economy.
So ditching your own currency and just adopting the dollar, I mean, that's a pretty big decision. What were the downsides to that?
Well, the biggest one, I think, was that El Salvador lost control over its own monetary policy, couldn't adjust interest rates or manage the money supply on their own anymore. They were kind of at the mercy of the U.S. Federal Reserve.
Yeah, so what happens if the dollar gets really strong? Doesn't that hurt the average person in El Salvador? I mean, like their buying power?
Yeah, exactly. That's the potential downside of a fixed exchange rate. Their exports could become less competitive too, compared to countries with more flexible currencies.
Right, it's like stability in exchange for less control.
Exactly, a trade-off.
Interesting. Okay, so we've got this dollarized economy, but there's another big piece of the puzzle before Bitcoin enters the scene: remittances.
Absolutely. Remittances are a huge deal for El Salvador. Back in 2020, they made up almost a quarter of the country's GDP.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, money sent back home by Salvadorans living abroad. It's a lifeline for their economy.
So I'm guessing that this reliance on remittances is going to play a big role when we get to the whole Bitcoin story.
Oh, yeah. Definitely keep that in mind.
Okay, so we've got the backstory now. How does Bitcoin go from, this fringe idea to being legal tender?
Well, it starts in a pretty unexpected place, actually. Not in a government building, but on a beach.
A beach, okay, I'm intrigued.
Yeah, El Zonte, this small coastal village, they earned the nickname Bitcoin Beach.
Bitcoin Beach. I like it, all right. What happened there?
So back in 2019, El Zonte gets this anonymous donation, like $100,000 worth of Bitcoin.
Wow, someone was feeling generous.
Yeah, but there was a catch. They had to create a circular economy around it.
So they couldn't just, cash it all out?
Nope, they had to put it to work in the community.
Interesting, okay.
And that's exactly what they did. People started using Bitcoin for everyday stuff, even people who didn't have bank accounts, buying groceries, paying for services. El Zonte became this real-world experiment in Bitcoin adoption.
So this tiny village becomes a testing ground for Bitcoin.
Pretty much. Yeah.
I'm guessing someone took notice of this little experiment.
You got it. Nayib Bukele, the president of El Salvador.
Yeah.
Young, tech-savvy, and he sees potential in Bitcoin, especially when it comes to those remittances we talked about.
Okay, and this is where things get really interesting. Bukele decides to make a big bet.
Yeah, in 2021 at the Bitcoin conference in Miami, Bukele drops this bombshell announcement. He's proposing a law to make Bitcoin legal tender in El Salvador.
Huge news shook up the financial world.
Yeah, for sure.
So was it just about remittances? Was that the main motivation?
Well, easier and cheaper remittances were a big part of it, but Bukele was thinking bigger too. He saw Bitcoin as a way to empower people who didn't have access to banks, attract foreign investment, make El Salvador this hub for innovation.
So kind of leapfrogging ahead, using Bitcoin to solve multiple problems at once.
Yeah, very ambitious.
And did it work? I mean, did the law actually pass?
You bet it did. And it went through the legislature super fast. Just a few months after Bukele's announcement, Bitcoin became legal tender in El Salvador.
Wow, so they went all in.
Yeah, they even put aside $150 million in cash reserves to back this whole Bitcoin system.
So they put their money where their mouth is, huh?
Yeah.
But was it all smooth sailing? I mean, was the reality as good as the vision?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting. We'll have to dive into how it all played out.
All right, so listeners, stay tuned. We're going to get into the implementation of this whole thing. The Chivo, Bitcoin wallet, and all the controversies that came up. It's a wild ride. So Bitcoin is official legal tender. They're setting up this whole system to support it. And then there's Chivo, this government-backed Bitcoin wallet. Tell me about that.
Yeah, Chivo, which I guess means cool in El Salvador. It was supposed to be like super easy to use, even if you didn't know anything about Bitcoin. The government even offered like a $30 sign-up bonus.
Wow. So they were really trying to get everyone on board.
Yeah, they wanted to make it like using any other banking app.
But I mean, something this big, this ambitious.
Yeah.
There's got to be some hiccups along the way, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Right from the start, there were tons of technical problems. People were saying payments weren't going through, transactions were getting stuck. There were even reports of people's identities getting stolen, so they lost out on that sign-up bonus.
Oh, man. So you're trying to like embrace this new financial system, but the technology itself isn't working.
Yeah, exactly. It created a lot of distrust.
Makes sense.
And then on top of that, there were all these questions about transparency. The government wasn't really open about how Chivo was being run, what their policies were, all that.
So that probably didn't help build confidence.
Nope, not at all.
So did the Salvadoran people push back against all this?
Oh, yeah, there were protests against Bitcoin law. People were worried about the economy becoming unstable. And a lot of them just didn't understand Bitcoin.
Right. And Bitcoin is known for being volatile. That's kind of the opposite of why they adopted the US dollar in the first place.
Exactly. Stability was the goal back then.
So was that a concern right from the get-go?
It was a huge concern. Even big international organizations like the World Bank and the IMF, they warned El Salvador about the risks of using something as volatile as Bitcoin, especially for a developing economy.
So they had internal pushback from citizens and external warnings from these global institutions? Sounds like a lot of pressure.
Definitely.
Did the government respond to any of this?
They did acknowledge the concerns, but President Bukele, he was still convinced that Bitcoin was the way to go. He said the problems were temporary, just growing pains.
Okay, so he's sticking to his guns. But let's get to the bottom line. Did people actually start using Bitcoin?
That's the thing. Despite all the government's efforts and all the hype, Bitcoin adoption was really low. Like a year after they made it legal tender, most people and businesses were still using US dollars for their everyday transactions.
Huh. So not exactly the Bitcoin revolution they were hoping for.
Yeah, not quite.
What about remittances? Did that at least work out?
Well, it was supposed to make things cheaper and faster, but the fees for using Bitcoin often canceled out any savings.
So one of the main arguments for the Bitcoin law didn't really pan out.
Yeah.
Were there any other unintended consequences?
Well, remember how we talked about Bitcoin being volatile? That came back to bite them. When the price of Bitcoin crashed, the value of El Salvador's national reserves took a big hit.
Ouch, that's gotta hurt.
Yeah.
Did they try anything else to like make this Bitcoin thing work?
Well, they had this idea to build Bitcoin City.
Bitcoin City. What is that?
It was going to be this whole city powered by energy from a volcano. With everything built around Bitcoin, they were even going to issue volcano bonds to fund it.
Volcano bonds. That sounds kind of crazy.
Yeah, it was a pretty out there idea. A lot of people didn't think it would ever happen.
So did it.
Nope, it got postponed. I think global economic uncertainty made some investors nervous. And, Bitcoin's volatility didn't help either.
So it seems like this whole Bitcoin experiment has been pretty rocky. Technical issues, resistance from the public economic uncertainty.
Yeah, it's been a roller coaster for sure.
But they haven't completely given up on Bitcoin, have they?
Not at all. Bukele is still a big believer. He even says that tourism has increased because of the Bitcoin law.
Interesting.
He sees El Salvador as this pioneer, a country that's not afraid to try new things.
So 2 years in, it's kind of a mixed bag.
Yeah, definitely.
Some people might even say it's been a gamble that hasn't paid off yet.
Maybe.
But is that the whole story?
There's definitely more to it. In the last part of our deep dive, we'll look at what the future might hold for Bitcoin in El Salvador and what it all means for the rest of the world.
Okay, so we've seen the ups and downs of El Salvador's Bitcoin journey. The big vision, the bumpy rollout, and kind of like where things stand now. But it feels like this story is still unfolding, right?
Yeah.
Where does El Salvador go from here? I mean, is this a temporary setback, or is this whole thing just doomed to fail?
Yeah. It's a tough question to answer. There's been a lot of debate about it. For sure, after 2 years, Bitcoin adoption is still pretty low. Those big promises of a totally transformed economy haven't really happened. And the losses they've taken because of Bitcoin's price swings, those have definitely raised some eyebrows, both in El Salvador and, among those watching from the outside.
And then there's the IMF, right? They haven't exactly been quiet about their concerns.
Yeah.
They're basically saying El Salvador should just ditch Bitcoin as legal tender altogether. Like they see it as this reckless gamble, especially for a developing economy.
Yeah, their argument is that Bitcoin is just too volatile, too risky. It undermines financial stability, and they think El Salvador would be much better off sticking with the US dollar. They've even hinted that, holding on to Bitcoin could make it harder for El Salvador to get international loans and financial help.
So basically, you have these big players in the financial world saying, turn back now. Did that have any impact on El Salvador's position?
It's interesting because even with all the challenges, the criticism, and the pressure from places like the IMF, President Bukele has actually doubled down on Bitcoin. He's presenting El Salvador as this kind of trailblazer, a country that's willing to embrace the future, even if it means going against the grain. He even points to the growth in tourism as proof that Bitcoin is putting El Salvador on the map.
That's a pretty bold stance. It's like he's saying we're doing things our way. But is it really accurate to say that Bitcoin is the reason for the increase in tourism? I mean,
Yeah.
couldn't there be other factors at play?
Oh, absolutely. There are always multiple things influencing something as complex as tourism. It's tough to say for sure that Bitcoin alone is responsible for the increase. But for Bukele, it seems like it's more than just numbers. It's about sending a message. El Salvador is looking ahead, and Bitcoin is a big part of that vision.
So you have these two very different perspectives. The cautious warnings from established institutions, and then this defiant optimism from a leader who sees Bitcoin as this path to a better future. What does this all mean for the average person in El Salvador? Are they actually benefiting from this experiment?
It's hard to say definitively. There are stories of some individuals and small businesses doing well with Bitcoin, especially those in tourism or tech. But for many people, the benefits are still unclear. They're dealing with the volatility, the technical issues, and just the general uncertainty of it all.
Which brings us back to that question we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
Is El Salvador's Bitcoin experiment a success, a failure, or somewhere in between?
Yeah, it's tempting to try and put it in a neat little box, but the reality is way more complicated. There have definitely been some setbacks. The low adoption rates, the problems with the Chivo wallet, the impact of Bitcoin's price swings on their national reserves, those are real issues. You can't just ignore them.
But they've also gotten the world's attention. They've started a conversation about cryptocurrency's place in national economies. They're experimenting, pushing boundaries, and challenging the way things have always been done. That has to count for something, right?
It definitely does. El Salvador has become this real-world case study, this testing ground for what happens when a country goes all in on Bitcoin. The whole world is watching, learning, and forming their own opinions. Some see it as a warning, a reminder of the risks that come with diving into the unknown. Others see it as this bold move, a sign that the future of finance could look radically different from what we're used to.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the big takeaways for our listeners? What can we learn from El Salvador's Bitcoin experiment?
I think the biggest lesson is that we're still figuring out cryptocurrency's role in the world. El Salvador's journey with its mix of ambition, setbacks, and uncertainty. It shows that there's no easy answer, no guaranteed outcome. It reminds us that innovation can be messy. Disruption comes with risks. And the future of finance is going to be this complex and constantly changing landscape.
So maybe a final takeaway is that we should all be asking these questions, having these conversations, thinking critically about the possibilities and the potential downsides of cryptocurrency.
Absolutely. Whether you're a tech enthusiast, a skeptic, or somewhere in the middle, El Salvador's story is a reminder that we're all part of this unfolding story. The choices made by governments, businesses, and individuals are going to shape the future of money. And it's up to all of us to stay informed, engaged, and ready to adapt as the world keeps changing.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave our listeners with one last thought to ponder. Imagine you're advising another country, thinking about following in El Salvador's footsteps. What advice would you give them? What lessons have we learned from this deep dive that could help them make their decision? Keep those questions in mind as you continue to explore the fascinating world of cryptocurrency and its impact on our world. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.